Once again, thanks to to Taneja ji and Professor Sinha for this opportunity. Thanks to all the faculty members and the students who are gathered here to listen to this IKS talks, a very important subject matter in today's context, especially in consideration of the value that it offers us to address many unmet medical needs and as well as other needs. So here I'll be providing an overview of the Indian knowledge systems. Am I loud enough? Okay, yeah. Okay, so I'll just be giving you an overview of the Indian knowledge systems. Okay, perhaps I would not be able to go into depth considering the time limits, but it will kind of give you a flavor of what our ancestors have given us, the value that we have been, kind of given, and our responsibility towards making it much more useful for the current times and as well as the future. So this is going to be a continuum, not only for us, but even for our future generations. So I think the youngsters sitting at the back, you hold a greater responsibility more than what we have, in terms of taking this heritage forward. So, as all of you know, India is a land of diversity, okay, be it the traditions or the culture. I did mention in the morning's address that, we are very proud of the food that we eat, the clothes that we wear, and all that. And it's not limited to us. I think the COVID 19 situation kind of, gave us a greater flavor of our Indian knowledge systems. We all resorted to having decoctions and good food that provides us greater immunity. Okay, so food, medicine, clothes, the textiles, the architecture that we are very proud of. I think Vadodara is again, a base for amazing structures, and the metallurgy, the art forms, the sahitya, the poetry, everything, be it, whatever be the subject areas that you are all here from, in every field we had excelled. And typically, the knowledge systems had been transmitted by the word of mouth, because that was the only way that knowledge was transmitted from one generation to the other. Perhaps in the later years, we had this Gurukul system where the Guru had transmitted his knowledge to the Sishyas, and that is how the Guru Sishya Parampara also kind of got engraved in our traditional knowledge systems. The cultural expressions, when you talk of dance, music, poetry, and others, even now, today, large part of it is transmitted through the Gurukul systems. The Guru teaches the youngsters who are interested in it, and then the art form continues. Okay, storytelling is again a very, very important aspect in our traditional knowledge systems. When I talk of storytelling, I'd like to kind of talk about the Indian knowledge in the context of the Indian knowledge systems. So, typically when you look at most of the rural areas in those days, people even reared elephants. Okay, so elephants were part of the farmlands, and while elephants were, matter of great pride and value to the farmers, they were kind of also nonsensical in the sense that they would go and destroy the farm produce. So typically, when a baby is born, okay, the legs are tied up, okay, to pole, so that the baby elephant gets to know discipline in its life. Okay, it is made to sit, and that is how it is controlled. It is conditioned to know that its leg is tied, so it can't go far beyond what the chain gives. Okay, so that is how it is. As elephant grows bigger, it still continues to sit in that place or stay in that place, irrespective of whether it is chained or not. Okay, in today's context, I think that is what we have all begun conditioned to realize, that our Indian knowledge systems is just a matter of heritage and is not of any meaning to our everyday life. I would like to break that. Remember this story and think about it, that whether you are conditioned to think that Indian knowledge systems is a matter of relic, or is it meaningful. And I hope by the end of this presentation today, I would have made a difference to the thoughts that you have. So While we talk of this Indian knowledge systems that has been transmitted from one generation to the other by word of mouth in later years, when scripts were created, okay, were invented, much of this was documented. This we call as a codified knowledge systems. Okay, so it was codified on palm leaves, on metal sheets, on rocks. It was engraved on rocks, on temple pillars, and many more. Okay, so much of the knowledge systems also got transmitted by this way. In later years, when paper was invented, and today we are very proud to have books that talk about our Indian knowledge systems as well. We have many samhitas, we have many books, in terms of that capture the essence of our knowledge systems. So there are two categories of traditional knowledge that I would like to talk about. The codified traditional knowledge that you see in the form of either manuscripts or books. The other one is a non-codified traditional knowledge, which is transmitted by word of mouth. This uncodified traditional knowledge is also of great relevance to us, because much of this oral traditional knowledge that we talk about is still means of livelihood to the people involved, the individual or the communities involved. So keeping this in mind, I'd like to move forward very quickly to give you a few examples of how large and diverse our knowledge systems are. Okay, so I start with the Indian systems of medicine, because currently the traditional knowledge digital library is largely focused on the Indian systems of medicine. In India, we are very fortunate to have the codified knowledge systems in medicine. So we call it as the classical systems of medicine, the Ayurveda, the Siddha, Unani, the Sovarikpa, and as well as the yoga practices, which is meant for both health and wellness. Okay, in addition to this classical systems of medicine, we also have the folk medicine. I think Professor Sinha mentioned that he had the Vaidyas in the village who provide local health traditions, practices to kind of help in human afflictions. So when we are talking of this Indian systems of medicine, largely the classical systems of medicine that I talked about, Ayurveda, Siddha, Unani, Sovarikpa, and also the yoga, they are all codified. When we talk of the folk medicines, the local health traditions, this is the oral traditional knowledge that we are talking about. So when we talk of the Indian systems of medicine, I think again we have been very fortunate, because these local systems of, these traditional systems of medicine have largely been plant-based. Okay, the biological diversity. In fact, Professor Sinha, again I'm referring to him, he mentioned about the medicinal plants in the campus. Okay, so the medicinal plants have been very important. Right from Rig Veda to Yajurveda to Atharva Veda, we had information that had been codified in terms of the knowledge systems, the medicinal plants that have been used in terms of the human afflictions, and as well as the plants, and as well as the animal health. Then you had Charak Samhita, Shushruta Samhita, Ashtanga Hridayam, Dhanvantari Nigantu, and many other Nigantus in the later years that all talk and codify information on the systems of medicine. And if you consider, there are more than 8,500 or maybe more than 10,000 plants that are used for different ailments, different diseases. And Ayurveda contains about 2,300, Siddha contains about 1,785 plants, Unani about close to 1,000, Sovarikpa about 700, so on and so forth. And if you consider folk medicines, over 5,000 different plant species are used by local health practitioners for treating human diseases. So with this vast and diverse knowledge, and just again give you a glimpse of how important our knowledge systems are. If you talk about Ayurveda, I'm sure many of you might have heard Triphala, right? And these are the three fruits that are used for treating various diseases. So it contains, Triphala contains Amla, Bibitaki, and Haritaki. I'm sure you will hear more from Professor Anab Thakur this afternoon. But just to say, the same Triphala, depending on what the carrier is, you would be having a different use of the same Triphala for treating different diseases. For example, Triphala, when it is used with sugar, it is used for treating acid peptic disease. If you use it with rock salt, it is used for Vata diseases. It can be used as a face pack, and also with oil for non-healing ulcers. it is used with ghee and honey for improving eyesight. So one particular formulation can be used for different diseases depending on what the carrier is. If we talk of gudichi, it is a single plant, okay, Tinospora cordifolia, and yet again the same thing depending on what the carrier is. Okay, if you talk of it with grita, that is the ghee, it is used for vata vitaka. If you use it with honey, it is used for kapha vikara. So a single plant species, depending on what the carrier is, can be used for the treatment of different disorders. Okay, that is what I want to tell you, the uniqueness and the importance of our Indian systems of medicine. In today's context, when you talk of modern drug discovery and development, okay, over the last about 40 years or so, okay, about 2,000 different drugs have been approved by different regulatory bodies. And out of this 2,000 different drugs that have been treated, over 40% of them belong to natural products. So it could be either plant derived directly, or it could be a derivative or a synthetic compound which has a natural product component in it. So this systems of medicine, when we are talking about the uniqueness, offers a great platform to validate and innovate further. Again, when we talk of a single disease, okay, so in today's context, when you say for COVID, okay, how much did we struggle? We did not even have a single drug to come out to treat COVID, okay. And look at the beauty of our Indian systems of medicine. You take one disease, vitiligo, it is a skin disorder, and it is formed because of the loss of melanocytes on the skin. It is basically the skin becoming white, and it is a social stigma also for many people who are afflicted with vitiligo. And look at the options that you have: Ayurveda, Siddha, Unani, homeopathy, even the folk medicines, and also to be accompanied with yoga therapy. There are different, again, plant-based medicines, okay, or even mineral-based medicines that are available to treat a single disease. Okay, so that's the beauty of our traditional systems of medicine that that is waiting to be looked upon and innovated further. Again, when I talked about, the carrier systems, right? Okay. And I told that depending on whether it is with oil or it is with ghee or it is with honey, the same, medicine formulation can be used for treating different disorders. I'll give you one example of flowers. So far, in our life, and I'm talking about, as a person, a layman who's not been associated with the Indian knowledge systems largely, okay, somebody to appreciate what Indian knowledge systems is all about, the diversity, the uniqueness, and the expanse of our knowledge systems. When you talk of flowers, we have all only appreciated flowers for the beauty that it holds, and perhaps as temple offerings, and perhaps as a decorative item in our houses. How many of you knew that flowers can be used as a treatment method? Okay, not very many. There would be only a few who would be aware of the fact that there is something called Pushpa Ayurveda also. So there is, again, a lot of information that has been codified for the use of flowers for treatments. And this comes from Kalyana Karaka, Ayurvedic treatise by a Jain physician, Ugraditya Acharya. So there are different ways how flowers can be used for treatment, and that is darshanam, sparshavidhanam, alepana, and agrana. So what is darshanam? You look at the flower, and then there is a therapeutic effect by just looking at the flower. When you talk of sparshavidhanam, it is about the touch. Okay, so there are certain flowers that are being advised to be worn as garments or put as caps or necklaces or bracelets and so on and so forth. So that is providing the sparsh. And when you talk of alepana, it is either used as a medicated drug, it is applied on the body or on a particular part of the body, and that is how this is used. Then you have the agrana vidhanam or nasya vidhanam, where it is applied into the nostrils so as to provide a treatment. And again, depending on how the flowers is consumed, it could be a rasa, that is an extract by taken out by crushing the flowers, or a hima by soaking it in water and using the water for treatment, quath, which is decoction, ark, which is distillation, sura, which is tincture, and so on and so forth. So this is again talking about the diversity and expanse of what flowers can do. Okay, and we are talking of only flowers. There are so many different botanical species available in the country, and in fact, India happens to be the 12th biodiversity hotspot in the world around. Okay, so we have a huge biodiversity that can be utilized, explored, and exploited for the betterment of all. So, when we are talking of again another aspect of Ayurveda, Siddha, Unani, or even folk medicines is in terms of the wellness and also the beauty. India has been known to be a beauty conscious nation since ages. It's not just today. In fact, you have a lot of temple architecture that talks about women holding a handbag, and somewhere they say they are holding a mirror, and the beauty of the decoration, everything has been inscribed as rock forms. And if you talk of even the books, there are huge number of books that talk about what our Indian knowledge systems contain, even in the domain of cosmetics. For example, there is this herbal formulation that has been mentioned for hair growth. So there is Mamsi, Kushta, Krishna Thaila, Sariva, and Nilotpala that are made into a paste with milk, and it is applied for improving hair growth. Similarly for pimples, so there are a lot of students who are now very beauty conscious, so as to get their acne removed. So there are herbal treatments available for that, and this has all been codified in our traditional texts. So when I talk to you about plants and Ayurveda traditional knowledge systems in the morning, I talked about reasoning, Ketu, the logic of art and debate and discussion, and how examples become important. And it's not just perception, it is also about doing things and then understanding whether it is useful or not. So this is how our knowledge systems have been created. In fact, if you look at Sushruta Samhita, it says that even those days, okay, when a student goes for learning medicine, he's not been given that graduation degree or so without understanding the plants. So before the student is said he is a Vaidya good enough to treat patients, he is made to go to the forest nearby, identify certain of the plants, and then come back. So when what today we talk as transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary work has been there even in those ages, where a physician is known to understand plants, only after that he is made to treat patients. Okay, so that is the beauty of our Indian knowledge systems. So when we talk of cosmetics and all that, I would also like to give you an example of perfumery. I talked about India being a very beauty conscious nation even in those times, right? Even perfumery held a very great aspect in our human health and hygiene. Okay, of course, we generally Indians do take bath every day in terms of being clean and all that, but in terms of being when you go for any socializing and all that, even those days it is mentioned that people use perfumery. And I give you two examples here. One is the Gandha Yukti, and the other one is the Gandha Arnava. So it is all about how perfumes had been made those days. So one example is from Brihat Samhita, Shloka 10. It talks about 9 different ingredients, okay, and using these 9 different ingredients, and no one single ingredient can be used in the same two proportions as the other, you can make perfumes. Okay, and they also tell about the process. And out of these 9 ingredients, if there is an ingredient which is more volatile than the others, these are the ones that are added later. So there is a science behind how perfumes have been made, and they say that by using these permutations and combinations, you can arrive at about 1.7 lakh, 3.6 lakh different formulations of the perfume that can be used. There is another example, that is Shloka 13 and 14 from Brihat Samhita, again talking about the Gandharnava, that is basically an ocean of perfumes. And they say, they have given this box, okay, and it talks about 16 different ingredients. You can pick any 4 of them. And again, those 4 cannot be used in the same proportion as the other. By using the permutations and combinations, you will be able to create 1.74 lakh different perfumes. And this is the beauty of our Samhita, and this has been validated as well. Okay, so each component has been used to see whether it provides that the perfumery compositions or not. When we talk of plants, it is very important to understand it's not just today. Even in those days, India has primarily been an agrarian society. Agriculture has been the staple livelihood of most of the people involved, okay, in the country, the population. And you have traditional texts, a huge number of texts, be it Krishi Parashara, Kautilya Arthashastra itself, Brihat Samhita that I mentioned, Patanjali Mahabhashya, then you have Ashrapa Krishi Shukti, Surapala's Vriksha Ayurveda, Lokopakara, and many other books, that talk about those traditional practices. So even in those days, it's not just today that we are talking about the empowering farmers for better livelihoods. Farmers held a very, very respectable place even in those times. And these are all the books. Even today, the Indian Council of Agricultural Research has gone to people, because besides what has been codified, the farmers in different villages have also had this oral traditional knowledge. So ICAR went about collecting all this traditional agricultural practices, and they have codified it, and some of them have been actually experimented with, validated, and out of almost, like, one of the books contain about 38 validated ITKs, and out of those 38, 23 have been multi-center trials, to kind of show that our oral traditional knowledge is also still valid in today's context, and it is not merely some hearsay or some blind practice by the farmers. I'll give you more examples of this. So one example is, today we talked about, of course, I'm talking to you standing on the grounds of GSFC, which talks about the fertilizers. And even in those days, natural fertilizers were used for us. We did not have chemicals at that time. So one example is of Kunam Chala, and it is considered to be the world's oldest fermented liquid manure. Okay, and it is organic because it contains only all the waste from the farmer's land. So Kunam Chala is a fermented biofertilizer and growth promoter. The original Kunam Chala that has been mentioned, it is called the filthy liquid also, Kunam Chala. Okay. And this Kunam Chala was originally made by the waste from the farmer's field. So all the animal bones, marrow, blood, fish, etc. And even the plant waste, that is sesame cake, germinated oat bean, rice husk, honey, ghee, they were all used to ferment it, and that was used in the farms of the people. So Kunam Chala held a great prominence, because in today's context, we are talking of, lot of diseases associated with high use of pesticides and fertilizers, chemical fertilizers in the field. So there is a, this one, there was a prominent agriculturist, Professor Y.L. Nene, who took a lot of interest in this Kunam Chala to see whether Kunam Chala that is mentioned in older times has any kind of validity or not. So he experimented in Guru Gobind Vallabh University at Uttarakhand, and he found that it does have a lot of importance and significance. It was validated. And later on, he realized in today's context, many people are, kind of a little averse to animal waste being used in a farmer's field, okay, as even fertilizer. So he thought, can we get rid of the animal waste and use only the plant waste, okay, to create a new Kunam Chala. So that is how the herbal Kunam Chala got created. And the herbal Kunam Chala, what he did is, to overcome, the loss of properties from the animal waste, okay, he also added weeds, okay. So these weeds provided for pesticidal and fungicidal activities as well. And this herbal Kunam Chala was then tested across different crop types in different regions, right from the north to the south. And, he found that productivity increases about 20 to 30% using this herbal Kunam Chala. Later on, in today's context, there are many, many scientists who have worked on different Kunam Chalas, that is in safari, that is where fish is used for the creating the Kunam Chala. Mushika Runapa, rats are found in the farmer's field, so the dead rats are used for creating the Kunam Chala. Kukuta Kunam Chala, where chicken flesh is used. Then Sarangadhara Kunam Chala, where different animal wastes are used for the Kunam Chala. Then you have Shashyagavya Kunam Chala, which is largely cow dung, cow urine, weed, and plant waste. And all of them have been experimented. The reason I'm showing all this information is to say that it is not mere word of mouth or my understanding of what is contained in an original text. These have all been scientifically validated to say that these traditional practices are still valid in today's context. I did mention that we do have codified texts, and there is oral traditional knowledge also. I give you one example again from the domain of agriculture to say how our traditional knowledge is still valid. when you talk about veterinary science, there is this foot and mouth disease in cattle, which is highly prevalent. And because of that, there's lots of productivity, especially when you have milking cows and other things, okay, or even the flesh of the animal. So, what a particular group in Orissa, especially from the Navapada district, these farmers use Harida and Bahada, that is Terminalia chipula and Bellerica, to treat animals having this foot and mouth disease. So what they do is that they take 500 grams of these powders, mix it with the water, and apply it after boiling it. Okay. And what I mentioned, right? ICR has validated many of the practices as well. So they gave this validation to the Department of Veterinary Science in Kolkata, and this was also kind of enabled by the KVKs. Okay, and what they did, a very scientific experiment. They took 5 different groups. One is the control group, where there is no treatment at all. Then the second one is which has been treated by this particular method, that is Harida and Bahida. The third group is where the root barks of a Kerala tree was used. The fourth one is where neem oil was used. And the fifth one is a conventional treatment, that is Baxivet was used. And after doing all these experiments in a controlled fashion, they realized that this particular ITK method was as effective as the conventional treatment, Baxivet. The only difference coming that in Baxivet, the animals recovered in 4 to 5 days, whereas in the ITK method, it took about 5 to 6 days. So that's the only difference. But in terms of cost effectiveness, the traditional method was much better than the conventional treatment. So there are these traditional knowledge. I keep repeating, it is not just a matter of relic or heritage. It is something that needs to be looked upon because it has relevance even today. And no subject or discussion will be complete without touching upon food and nutrition, because that is what we all aspire. At the end of the day, it is all roti, kapda, or makan, right? Roti happens to be the first thing. So coming back to our traditional food and nutrition, there are books that talk about our traditional foods. Of course, much of it is oral traditional knowledge, yet even this has been codified. And the beauty of it, I'll give you from one book, Kshema Kutuhala. Kshema Kutuhala has been written by Kshema Sarmam, and this is from Karnataka. And he talks about, Paka Shastra, Paka Kala, that is the dietetics and the culinary art. And even in those days, they talk about 12 different chapters. They call it as Utsavas. The first one talks about Dravya Pakas. The second chapter talks about the utensils for cooking. The third one talks about the qualities of the physician and cook. So it is not just because much of this cooking was meant for the royal families as well, right? So there was a physician who was involved before the food has been given to the royal family. Then the seasons and the routines you follow, daily routine, I think Ritucharya, Dinacharya is also mentioned in Ayurveda. And then you have about the non-vegetarian food, meat food, cooking of fish. Then you have a chapter on different kinds of vegetables. Then you have a chapter that is talking about food from flowers. Then the third one talks about the cooked foodstuffs, appetizers, dairy products. This is the kind of expanse that our traditional knowledge systems has, And talking about not only the food, it is also about how it is served. If you go to the South India, especially Tamil Nadu and Kerala, you find much of the food is given on plantain leaves. So even that has a lot of health benefits from that. It is not just a matter of cordial relationship with the guest, but it also helps in digestive fire. Then you use the Butium monospora or palash leaf, and it is it is known to alleviate vata and kapha, and also used for ascites and abdominal tumor. Then you have the castor bean leaf, and so on and so forth, to kind of say that every leaf that has been used in the Indian knowledge systems has a health benefit, a wellness benefit as well. In later years, of course, we realized that we need to have conservation of biodiversity and sustainable use of it, and metallurgy became important because we started using metal plates and so on and so forth. So talking of metallurgy, Indians again excelled. Many people who have come to Delhi would know that we have the iron pillar, which is yet not rusted, and it is over, several hundreds of years. Okay, and metallurgy, Indians had been good at metallurgy. And one classical example, I'm just giving you a few examples because Indian knowledge system is so vast, I cannot touch upon every aspect of it. It is just to kind of give you a glimpse that how vast and diverse it is. So there is a particular steel called wood Roots steel. Okay, and in today's terminology, we can call it as the high grade, ultra high carbon steel. Okay, and this was produced way back by uneducated metallurgists or metal artisans from Tamil Nadu. Okay, it is called ukku, and this was prepared by preparing porous iron, hammering it when it is still hot. Then they add wood pieces to it from certain herbs, and that is again burnt, and this wood pieces form the carbon in it, and that is how the entire high grade ultra high carbon has been produced. So by this method, which is very rigorous, a uniform composition of 1 to 1.6% carbon could be used, and this particular steel has been used by Damascus swords. This steel would be exported, and that is how the Damascus swords were created. And Damascus swords were very, very significant in those days because it was known to cut the head of a man with ease as it would cut a silk scarf. Okay, so that was the kind of the properties associated with that particular steel. Coming to alloys, I think all of you know that again, India had excelled in different kind of alloys. I just give you examples from one state, Kerala. So you have this Aranmula metal mirror. All of us in today's context, we have mirrors at home. They are all glass mirrors. And, depending on the quality of it, you can see yourself either blown up or very thin, sometimes very short, sometimes very long and all that, okay? When you talk of this Aranmula metal mirrors, it is only metal based. There's no glass used, okay? And the refractive index is such that you see your original self, nothing expanded or compressed. Okay, and this is made by a casting route. It contains tin, zinc, phosphorus, iron, nickel, and copper. Several IITs also tried to recreate this Aranmula mirrors. They have not been able to do that, but the family, the community in Kerala still makes these Aranmula mirrors. Okay, so that's the beauty of it. So very often when you talk about the community knowledge, they may not be willing to come and share with you the entire information because they fear loss of their livelihoods. Okay, but it needs to be kind of continued forward, because unless you have a faith and discussion, continued discussion with them, you may not be able to learn their practices. You have this Kadavalur eating bowl. Again, it is made by repeated thermomechanical processing. I'm using the modern terminologies to indicate how those alloys were created those days. Then you have the Swami Malai and Mannar icons of vessels and bells. It is made by the lost wax process. Okay, and every of these alloys are very, very unique. In fact, there is one particular article that says that in earlier times or even now, brass is largely made of copper and zinc, 64% copper, and typically the zinc is about 36%. But the brass of India, especially from the Lothal region here, from the Indus Valley civilization, they realized that it has a zinc percent of only 6%, and yet it has been a very strong alloy that has been created. So when you talk of this different traditional knowledge, and you can go into a lot of discussions because it encompasses so many subject areas. It would be difficult for me to kind of complete it within this 1 hour. So I quickly go over to the art forms, the cultural expressions. This Chatushashti Kala is a 64 art forms, okay, and it talks about right from singing to dancing to theatricals to practical application of aroma oils, setting ornaments, juggling, reciting books, and even language. Okay, so practicing language and so on and so forth. It would be, I'm just giving you a glimpse, truly so, because it tells about, when we are talking of education, we had not been focused as a country to only impart what is known as, the higher education or the classical knowledge of the, the more elite people. It talks about even the cultural expressions that have been the livelihood means of many people, the communities and the people involved. So talking about the different cultural expressions and the knowledge, it again gives you a vast impact about how Indians had progressed from from the times, whatever we say, thousands of years or whatever, with a long history of traditions and culture. We need to see how it is going to impact our lives in today's context, because we cannot forget the foundation on which we have been grown. And I'll quickly again touch about what is there from the Gujarat. I'm sure I don't need to tell you people, you are the ones to tell me what is more from from your region, because this has been the the cradle of the Indus Valley civilization, the Harappan civilization, and many more important events for the nation. I just touch upon a few things. The bead craft of Kambat, which holds greater than 5,000 years legacy. This is a specialized craft made from semi-precious stones like agate and carnelian and so on. In fact, even those days when you talk of the Gulf of Cambay or Gulf of Kambat, this has been a hub for trading cotton, silk, spices, timber, and goods. In fact, Gujarat was known for the finest cotton that has been created in the country. In fact, many people traded gold, diamonds, and many other precious stones for cotton from Gujarat. And of course, leather also had a very important say, because they said that shoes were exported from the Gulf of Cambay to the other countries even in those days. Salt, this is known as the white gold also. Okay, I don't need to again explain to the participants here how important it is, but to say that when we are talking of the Indian knowledge systems, it is not just to appreciate what has been good in the past, but it is also to highlight that there are challenges in today's context for those people who are still continuing with the knowledge systems, and how can people like you and I help those communities. So here I give you an example of the indigenous salt farming by the Agaria community from this Kutch region. They still follow the indigenous practice. So here what they do is that they bring the brine, that is the salt water, to the surface using pumps, of course, okay, and they pump out this brine water into salt pans, okay, and then once it is put, they let it evaporate by solar evaporation, and they add few twigs to it so that the salt crystallizes. And this salt, there are three varieties of salt that are produced: Vadagara, Poda, and Karkach, depending on the size. The Vadagara is the largest, and the Karkach is the smallest. And of course, Karkach is the most valuable also, because it's the finest and very good quality of salt. But what happens is that, they are having challenges. One, because the site that they choose, every year they come, I think the September time is when they go to those areas to identify sites, and then this is all government allotted. But those sites don't seem to be promising, because they cannot get the brine water out. Okay, so that is a loss of livelihood for the Agarias. The other one is that the salt water seeps back into the soil. Okay, so to prevent that, the farmers use their legs to make sure that the water doesn't flow back, and because of that, their legs have got calcinite, such that when they go for cremation, that part remains unburnt. Okay, so these are all life challenges that can be addressed through modern science and technology and better understanding their livelihoods. So this is an almost extinct process which needs to be reinvigorated, because it has lot of ecological and climate change impacts as well. Of course, I did mention about the salt as a white gold, but while I was doing the survey, thanks to Professor Sinha for giving this opportunity, because I myself had to go back and read what is there in this particular region. And I came to, while I did understand that cotton was important, and cotton those days was again considered as white gold, there are references in Rig Veda, and as well as the Indus Valley civilization archaeological studies that talked about the use of cotton. Marco Polo had happened to mention that this is one of the finest cotton varieties that came from Gujarat. So this cotton cultivation in Gujarat happens to be from different soil types, be it sandy or alluvial or even the black cotton soil. And there are different varieties. I'd like to touch upon only one variety, which is actually happens to be new to me also, the Kala cotton. Okay, the Kala cotton of Gujarat happens to be something very unique, because it is, it can grow in very resilient conditions as well. Okay, it is has a high tolerance for both disease and pest, and because of that, they don't use pesticides or fertilizers to grow this cotton. So it is automatically organic as well. And this particular Kala cotton happens to be mentioned in the Harappan civilization as well. It is largely hand spun, and they use natural pigments for dyeing the particular cotton. And here, of course, the only problem was that spinning of the cotton, because it has only short staple lens, it was difficult. So now the government has introduced this Kala Cotton initiative to promote spinning, and it is largely what was hand spun is now trying to be used with machines and so on and so forth to kind of reinvigorate this particular Kala Cotton. Another very important example is we talk about intercropping largely, in our agricultural systems. It is like, when you have between two seasons, what is the crop that is to be used and all that. There is a very unique system from Gujarat. It is called the Ramol. So here what they use is 4 to 5 crops are used at the same time, and the farmers reap benefits of the cultivation of this Ramol. Again, here this particular thing is that the farmers know which are the 4 crops to use. It can't be used at random. So this is, again from the Kutch area. They have the knowledge of soil science, root systems, native seeds, timing of agricultural activities, and so on and so forth. Not only that, whatever is agricultural produce that has been reaped, the farmers have the knowledge of how to store it as well, so as to reap benefits out of it. Then you do, as I mentioned, the Indian knowledge systems is not limited to food, agriculture, and so on and so forth. You talk about architecture, I did mention, right? You have the most beautiful palaces and forts in this particular region. I also talk about, very small structures. And I'm sure all of you have heard about the Bhuj tragedy in 2001. And we keep, facing these calamities from time to time. There is a particular architectural option called the bungas, okay, and these are made of mud bricks, or and the interior is made of tree branches packed with mud. Sometimes they use iron beams to support the roof structure. So during this Bhuj tragedy, very quickly these bungas were created, almost 1,400 of them, and 2 bungas were given per family to kind of bring them back to normalcy, those affected people. The same bunga architecture was used when Bihar had faced the Kosi flood in 2008. And here almost like 1 lakh houses were created as rehabilitation initiative from the government of India. So it's not, again, I repeat, when we talk of Indian knowledge systems, it is not a matter of relic or just archival. It is also relevant in today's context. It's all about the application of mind with creativity and innovation that needs to be paid attention to. I know all of you are aware that Gujarat pottery is very, very important, and the traditional method of making the pottery is opening the brick, the clay articles in open fire kiln. IIT Delhi came into place to kind of improve upon the efficacy of such things. They created what is called the closed kilns, okay, wherein they are able to reduce the firewood to 50% and also increase the energy efficiency. So whatever was taking about 36 hours for in the open kilns, now the drying or heating them, these pottery took only about 4 to 5 hours. So there is room for modern science and technology intervention to enhance the traditional knowledge systems. One another very important craft from cultural expression from Gujarat is again the Namda craft. Again, thanks to Professor Sinha, because I had to read a lot about Gujarat before coming here. I felt that, generally when you go to any Kashmir emporiums, you find this kind of art and craft there, this woolen wear, okay. I did not realize that this is also a tradition of Gujarat until I read this particular article and papers, okay. So this particular Namda craft is made of felted carpets and rugs from wood and indigenous wool, okay. And this is of course practiced in Iran, Afghanistan, and different parts of India as well. As I mentioned, Kashmir is also there. And here in Gujarat, I believe this particular craft is practiced by the Pinjara and Mansuri communities of Kutch. And again, this is an oral traditional knowledge that has been passed on from one generation to the other. So here it is a very cumbersome process. It requires different shapes of raw wool. So if you look at the picture here, it talks about yeah, it talks about just creating the art form, okay, the shape of it, and thereafter in the open spaces they put the woolen material, okay, and the woolen can be dyed prior also depending on what color you want, okay, and after this is made and dried, then they heap it on with a lot of wool, okay, apply soap solution so that the woolen comes together and sticks to it, okay. It's a very laborious process, and thereafter you see the fine goods. So many of us who are not aware of the process will only appreciate the goods, and when they ask us a reasonable amount of money, we tend to bargain with them saying that ye bas ye chota sa piece of work hai. We don't understand the labor that has gone into creating this particular art form. So I believe the government of Gujarat has taken an initiative for the Desi Wool Indigenous Wool Initiative to help this community. So there are a lot of S&T interventions that can be created to help overcome this laborious process, and how it can all be mechanized for better efficiency. When we are talking of local health traditions and this one knowledge, medicine happens to be a very very important aspect, not only in India but worldwide as well. So here about the Maldaris and the Bagia communities from Kutch, there was a survey done, and there are almost like these a survey was done among a small set of people, and they found that almost like 40% of the Bhagiyas, they provide treatment not only for their own animals, but for the animals from outside their village as well, and some for their own animals which are there in their own household. And not only that, these healers from this community, they also not only treat the animals and all that, they also have they use herbs and plants and trees for treating these animals across 39 disease categories. So just to kind of give you an example of the bubble tree, this is called the Deshi bubble, Acacia nilotica. And if you look at it, again, as I mentioned, for the human disease in Ayurveda, there's a single plant that is used for different diseases. You have the same Deshi bubble used for fracture, prolapse, conjunctivitis, diarrhea, arthritis, depending on how it is used, okay. And this has been validated by the veterinary science. And yet again, this community is at on the verge of losing this knowledge, because many of their youngsters are not willing to go with the trade, and there's no written record of it. So there's something that the GSFC can also do is in terms of documenting this knowledge. I mentioned in the morning today that India is bestowed with lot of traditional knowledge, and they are also very fortunate to be bestowed with a government that looks very positively at the knowledge systems that have emanated from the country thousands of years ago. The national education policy and as well as the national innovation policy talk about the knowledge systems of India. I did mention to you that Indian knowledge systems will be a part of the school curriculum as well as a college curriculum and higher curriculums as well, both in terms of education and as well as research. In fact, it is so very inclusive that the tribal ethnomedicinal practices, forest management, crop cultivation, natural farming will all be part of the curriculums that one needs to study. In terms of the intellectual property, that is the innovation policy, we have traditional knowledge and biodiversity resources as part of the vision statement, where it says that in an India where knowledge is the main driver of development and knowledge owned is transformed into knowledge shared. So we, being so very fortunate, we look for lot of room for further improving upon it. As a person coming from the modern science and technology domain, everything that I do, I feel that I need to be credited with that invention or knowledge, okay. And often in the science and technology community, one aspect of all of this is intellectual property rights. In fact, most of the educational institutions have an intellectual rights policy, and that is what I talked to Professor Sinha about. And it is a means of our assessment also. When we talk about publications, yes, but then they also say, if I'm talking of technology, whether I have filed an IPR or not, and what are the typical IPR frameworks, and why is IPR important? When you talk of intellectual property rights, it is a legal provision. these are largely enabled by what is called acts, okay, and thereafter the rules are given. So everything that we talk about intellectual property rights is a legal provision. And the first and foremost, especially for the S&T community, is patents. When we talk of patents, it is about grant on our invention, which is novel, inventive, and also has a particular utility, applicability of it, and this provides the ownership rights on that particular invention for about 20 years. So when we are from the cultural expressions, our creativity, we express our creativity in a particular format, be it music, dance, or poetry, or even books and all that. Copyrights become important. In addition to that, the other frameworks that are available are trademarks, industrial designs, geographical indications, plant variety protection, so on and so forth. And why am I talking about all of this when I'm talking about traditional knowledge of India? Isn't our traditional knowledge just our intellectual property? I mean, it has been there with us, okay? It's not a right, of course, no legal provision yet. But then it is something that has been carried on since generations and has been given by our ancestors. And why is it important? Because I told you this morning that we at the TKDL work towards protecting traditional knowledge. And what is the genesis? When we talk about patents and similar such IPR rights, I mentioned that it is all about gaining ownership of what we have created. We become the legal owners. Once we become the legal owners, we can play monopoly with that particular invention. Either I can use it for my own commercial interest, or I can license it to somebody, or I can make sure that somebody else does not exercise rights. Okay, I can do whatever I want because now I'm the legal owner of that knowledge. So this happened when India signed into the TRIPS agreement in 1995. Until then, we were only recognizing process patents. No product patents were recognized. So while we were in the transition, India also recognized that many of our traditional knowledge aspects, which are almost like everyday use in our livelihoods, these have become subject matter of patents, not only applications but a grant. So that means the legal ownership of such knowledge has been transferred to the new owner, that is whoever is the inventors and assignees of the patents. So classical examples of what we call this as misappropriation, that is a third party taking undue rights or illegal rights on somebody else's knowledge without any permission. And when bioresources are used, it is called biopiracy. So classical examples of misappropriation and biopiracy are haldi for wound healing, basmati rice, which is a staple diet of North India, fungicidal formulation from neem. Even today, haldi, when you cut your finger in the kitchen, the first thing that your mother or grandmother would say is put a pinch of turmeric and it heals the wound. Okay, basmati rice, even today we all eat. Okay, especially in the northern India. Neem is still being used by farmers in the fields, and these were all subject matters. What we say as everyday aspects of life have been subject matter of patent applications, and we granted. The only way that you can go and find a patent grant once a patent is granted is only by litigation. And all of you would appreciate when you talk of litigation, it's a long drawn process. A lot of money is involved and a lot of effort is also involved. You need a lot of patience for that. But taking cognizance of the fact that India has lost rights over its own traditional knowledge, though in 1995 we're not in an era where there is a lot of so much information on the internet, or we were so developed as we were in the 1995, a mere developing country. We realized that we need to take the risk to fight these USPTO and the EPO against such patent grants. So we went in for a litigation. It took a lot of time, between 3 to 13 years. The NEEM case was fought by Dr. Vandana Shiva from Navadanya Foundation. It took 13 years for her, but we fought, okay? And we gave all the relevant literature to the patent offices. We were able to revoke the patents in the case of turmeric and as well as the neem. All the patents were cancelled. But in case of basmati, out of the 20 claims that the inventors made, only 3 were allowed. The remaining 17 was cancelled. Having learnt a lesson, okay, we have a challenge, but to find a solution to that, we need to understand what the root cause is, right? So we realize that when we are talking of traditional knowledges, we are all very proud of it, okay? But is that traditional knowledge of ours, okay, in a format that is understandable by patent examiners worldwide? why did the patent examiners, having this information, still grant patents? That was the question. Okay, we realized that although we talk about codified text, I showed you a lot of books, right? And in which languages were they? They were all in our own Indian languages largely. And this particular set of books, or even the codified knowledge, is not part of what the patent examiners look at when they look at literature. For a patent to be granted, I mentioned 3 points. One is novelty, the second one is inventive strength, the third one is the application or the industrial applicability of that particular invention. So while we talk about our traditional knowledge, our knowledge is not in a format that patent examiners can look and understand that this whatever is application invention talks about, it is not novel or inventive. So the government of India decided, let's make our traditional knowledge in a format that patent examiners can understand. Thereafter, no misappropriation or biopiracy of Indian traditional knowledge can happen. So the responsibility was given to the Council of Scientific and Industrial Research, CSIR, to which I belong, and the Department of Indian Systems of Medicine, which is now, and Homeopathy, which is now the Ministry of Ayush. So this, started as a collaborative activity between the CSIR and Ministry of Ayush. It was the first of its kind globally. A lot of, consultations were done with World Intellectual Property Organization, USPTO, EPO, the Japanese Patent Office, and all that. So what we do is transcribe the information of our traditional knowledge in English, French, German, Japanese, and Spanish. We give access of the TKDL database to patent officers who have signed agreements with us. In addition to that, we file what is called third-party observations and pre-grant oppositions. While we were doing that, we also amended the Patent Act in the country to ensure our traditional knowledge is protected from misappropriation. So Section 3P was introduced in the Patent Act to ensure no traditional knowledge can be patented. So traditional knowledge cannot be a subject matter of a patent application. Only innovations further to what is mentioned in the traditional knowledge can be patentable subject matter. So what do we do in the TKDL? It is an interdisciplinary activity where traditions meet technology. What do I mean by that? So here, the traditional knowledge is digitized. We transcribe the information. So we engage doctors of Ayurveda, Siddha, Unani, so because at that point of time, and even now, there are a lot of patent applications relevant to our traditional knowledge that are being filed in the pharmaceutical and the cosmetics sector. So we have these doctors, okay, who look at all the codified texts so far, and they transcribe the information, and this information is then provided to patent officers. In today's context, we talk about deep learning, we talk about machine learning, we talk about artificial intelligence, and we say that there's so much data we need to standardize the data, we need to normalize the data and all that. So these days itself, this I'm talking about 23 years ago, when TKDL was conceptualized, we had put in place all those things. So what do I mean by that? I kept on saying that, we transcribe the information. Okay. What do I mean by that? So when I talk about an Ayurveda shloka, say Gudichi Kwat, okay, when I do a transliteration or a translation of that particular shloka, all you would get is what I have put it in the yellow box. Okay. It tells you the ingredients, and those ingredients are used for a particular disease. If I give this translated or transliterated information to the patent offices, do you think that patent grants can stop? The answer is a simple no, because patent examiners would not go beyond what is mentioned in that particular text. So what we did is that we transcribed the information such that our traditional terminologies have connect with the modern terminologies. So every plant is given a particular name in the Ayurveda or different systems of medicine. We capture that, we capture the local names, and we also capture the botanical name, because once you put the botanical name, it becomes easy for the patent examiners also to identify what is it. The other very important aspect when you talk of patent application, whoever has filed one would know that there is a description, there is a specification, and then comes the claims. Okay, so when we talk about all that, we have to tell what is that plant used for, how much it is used for. That is what we do from the shloka, without going beyond what is known in the prior art information. We say which part of the plant is used, because not every plant is used as a whole plant, sometimes stem, sometimes root. And we also mention how much part of that particular plant is used. Typically in any traditional systems of medicine, they say a pinch of this, something to the feet, cat's feet, claw or something like that, And here we mention how much part of that particular plant is used, so as to give a complete information of what that particular polyherbal formulation or a monoherbal or a herbal mineral composition contains. Then we mention what is the process by which it is produced. Okay, how is that particular drug given to the patient or even to the animal or plant, and what is for what disease it is used. Sometimes in Ayurveda or in the other systems of medicine, they mention the dietary recommendations. It could be a restriction or it could be a recommendation. All that is captured. And importantly, for patent offices like the USPTO, you have to mention that this is already published and known information in our Indian literature. So we mention the bibliography also. So this is the value add that the TKDL provides in terms of documenting our traditional knowledge, and everything is codified in the form of the TKRCs, that is Traditional Knowledge Resource Classification Codes. So if I search for, I urge all of you to go visit the TKDL website. So when I search for any particular herb, okay, the terminology is so standardized that you can get information from all the systems of medicine. So there's standardization of the terminologies, uniformity in terms of the terminologies and all that. So it kind of helps one system to talk to each other, so we can understand the complementarity and the differences in the different systems of medicine as well. I'm very proud to say that the TKDL is rich with 500,000 formulations from these different systems of medicine and as well as a yoga, covering about 645 books, and we are still counting. And each of the formulation within the system of medicine is unique. There are no duplicates in it. When we find 2 books talking about the same formulation, we only increase the bibliography. While we give this information to patent officers, 16 patent officers who have signed agreement with us, we notice that there's still gap in understanding of those patent examiners. So there is a provision in different patent offices that allows us to file for oppositions, and this is what is called the third-party observation or pre-grant opposition. So wherever we find relevance of traditional knowledge in a particular patent application, we write to those patent offices along with the evidences from the TKDL to oppose grant of that particular application, taking notice of the TKDL. Different patent offices have allowed for either rejection of the patent application, amendment of the claims, or sometimes based on the TKDL evidences, the applicant either withdraws the application or abandons the application. So these are all the positive outcomes, and in 353 such cases, we've been able to get positive outcomes. It's a long, laborious process, a manual process, but we have been still continuing it since 2009. And so this is the kind of impact that the TKDL does. Based on what we have been doing so far, the Government of India urged that we also include oral traditional knowledge. As I mentioned, when we talk of oral traditional knowledge, it belongs to individuals, it belongs to communities. So we need to ensure that those people do not lose their rights over their knowledge, because once you collect that knowledge and put it in public domain, it becomes a prior art information. So anybody and everybody who has access to the knowledge can exercise it. So to ensure that, we are bringing in ethical guidelines to say that when we are talking about documenting or working with oral traditional knowledge, we need to ensure that there is empathy and partnership in all such cases. And here the 3 cardinal principles that we are talking about is prior informed consent. So we mentioned to the knowledge holders, what are we going to do with that knowledge that we are documenting, okay, and how are we going to put that in public domain based on the expressed interest of the knowledge holder and their objectives. We ensure that we respect the people's rights. The other thing is, typically in any kind of ethnobotanical or ethnomedicinal work, we do a lot of survey, collect all that information and publish research publications in our own names. Okay, we do not mention what the knowledge holder has contributed, and in fact here the knowledge is all theirs. Okay, so here what we are talking about is attribution of that knowledge. So acknowledgement and recognition becomes very important. The last but not the least is access benefit sharing. So when we work with traditional knowledge systems, especially those of the communities, we need to ensure that if we reap any benefits out of that knowledge, say we transfer the technology or we make a commercial enterprise, the benefits of that need to reach the knowledge holders. So this is the guidance document which will be rolled out by the CSIR very soon. So taking cognizance of the the work that we have been doing in the TKDL and as well as the impact, I'm very glad to say that the government of India took cognizance of the value that the TKDL has created over these last 23 years. And in August 2022, the government of India finally gave approval that we can, open up the database to all other researchers as well, and thereby we can, promote R&D and innovation in the country. Of course, I talked about oral documentation, oral traditional knowledge documentation. We are also expanding TKDL into other areas like agriculture, metallurgy, and so on. And we will continue to make efforts with the World Intellectual Property Organization to make TKDL as part of the PCT minimum documentation, whereby all patent offices will be mandated to use a TKDL as a prior art information. So this is the vastness of our traditional knowledge systems of India. And the more you use it, the more we all use it, it will grow further. I look forward to all your cooperation and support in making this a reality. Thank you so much.